everybody, and welcome to another hobby cheating video. And today we are going to be talking about painting black. Black is a tough color to paint, not because it's actually hard to turn things black, or like when you're painting yellow or colors like that, it can often just be hard to actually achieve the color. Black, however, is challenging because it's a boring color. It's flat. So we've got a couple paints that we're going to use throughout the process today, but before we get into that, I want to talk about the nature of what black as a color is. So black and white are the same. I know that sounds weird, but it's true. So colors, the normal things we paint miniatures, that is to say, a color like this is a color, right, reflects some portion of the spectrum back to your eye, right? That's why it appears the color it does. So that's, I've said before that painting is all about understanding how light works, and never is it more true than in painting black and white. So black and white both interact with the entire spectrum. The difference is in reflectivity, right? So the visual spectrum, white tends to reflect all of it back to our eye at a very high level, a high level of reflectivity. Black reflects more or less none of it. I mean, obviously some comes back, you can still see the color, but it's, has a very low reflectivity. It absorbs most of the color that hits it. As a result, what you see then is the color black. So, and it's a tough thing to paint because true black is also as dark as you can go. Hence, there is no way to shade true black. It's just black. And any kind of highlight of black isn't black, it's just gray. It's increasing the amount of light that reflects off of the black and hence moves it up the spectrum toward white, right? Okay, so that's why it's often challenging, because if you go too far, it can very quickly become gray and not black anymore, as it appears to the eye. Yet, we all have seen various things that are black, like a pair of black leather boots, or a black dress, or something like that. And they don't really appear jet black. Very few things in the world are actually jet black. Even this thing, like the base of this, this paintbrush, right, which is ostensibly black. If I asked you what color it was, you would say black. But if you look at it, because it's got this sheen, you can see where the light is hitting it right here, right, which is creating a different color tone because it's glossy and reflective, right? And so that's changing the way that your eye perceives it. At the same time, there's a difference in the color. But if I hold it like that, you can see that the underside here is darker than the top side here, right? You don't really think about all that when you just sort of cast your eyes about in the world. Things just appear black. So anyway, all that's preamble to just talk about the nature of painting black. So we're going to do a very fun but challenging thing today. We're going to paint this Chaos Warrior, and we're going to make him more or less all black, but we're going to try to make him interesting still. Okay? So, and the reason I picked this guy is because he's perfect for what I want to do. So he's got a cloak, which we're going to do like black linen. He's got boots. He's got his little booties, which are going to do like black leather. And then he's got armor, which we're going to do like black metal. And then he's got weapons, which we're going to do like black steel. Oh boy, tuck in. Here we go. So we're going to do this in order. Okay? So let's talk about black linen first. All right. So black linen is the least reflective, right? It has no gloss to it. What we're talking about here is cloth. Just regular cloth. Not satin, not leather, cloth. It's going to have the least amount of highlight because it's simply, it has no sheen or anything. It's reflecting the least light back up. Hence, it's absorbing the most light. Hence, it appears the most black. Now, what I did to prep this miniature is just prime it in a German gray, as always, and then took it and did a light zenithal. This was very light of white, just to trace out my highlights. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to start with a cloak, and we're going to start with our friend the Vallejo Model Wash. One way you can get to a good black is by taking a dark black wash, or something like this, which this isn't actually black, it's dark gray, but we're going to start here. And we can climb our way down to it. It can often be easier and smoother than highlighting up. One of the problems with highlighting up is that white tends to create the hardest lines in white tends to create the hardest lines in trying to blend things together. So, but black tends to glaze on pretty smooth. Great, let's use that to our advantage. So let's start taking this black and let's place it in here, or this dark gray as it were, and let's start placing it into our shadows. And let's bring our shadows down nice and slowly. Okay? So what I'm doing here is just reverse, I'm just shading it, right? I mean, I would say I'm reverse highlighting, but that's not really true. I'm just shading it. I'm not just applying a wash thickly. You'll notice I'm purposefully laying it into a particular place, right? I'm being targeted with it. Now, I'm not necessarily having the lightest touch in the world, but I'm also not going hog wild here. And what I'm going to do is, over a couple layers, at first, I'm just going to cover kind of like that, right? So what we get is something like that area. And then once I have very little wash left on the brush, then I'm going to hit my higher areas and start dragging it up, because I want the bottom of the cloak to be the lightest. Okay? A wash like this, if you and by the way, I'm using this Vallejo, this thing I talk about in pretty much every video, the Vallejo model wash for grain dark vehicles, dark gray. If you don't have that, you could always use like a Nuln Oil or something like that. That's fine. The reason I don't like Nuln Oil as much is because it does have brown in it, so it is going to create other colors. Okay, so you can see how that went on there, right? And now what's happening is we're starting to actually turn the cloak black. Now, if we don't want this bottom to be this light, we can just very lightly start smoothing that back up in. Now, at this point, I have very little paint on my brush, and that's intentional. Okay, now I'm going to let that dry completely. Because what is going to happen here, while that's drying, I'm going to prepare the next thing I'm going to do. Because I'm going to get out a straight black, like an actual true black. In this case, I'm actually going to grab my old friend, black ink. Now, this is really strong stuff, okay? Like, will just turn something black in a snap. I'm going to put just a drop of this ink out there onto my wet palette. And I'm using my wet palette because I want it watered down a little bit. And as a point of fact, I'm actually going to grab a little thinner medium as well and get that on my palette, because I want to be able to thin that black ink down. What we're going to do is we're going to try to be very controlled with this. We're going to create the variance by creating our dark areas instead of trying to highlight up our light areas. That's why we started with the zenithal. We don't need a lot of variation with this one, because, remember, this is the linen, so this has the least amount of variation. Okay? All right. So now that's all dry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start laying in that black ink into these very dark sections. I'm pulling it up toward the top. I'm getting the bottom of the ridges, that kind of thing. Okay? Now, wipe my brush. And then since it's the ink and it dries slow, I'm going to, with my wet brush, just start dragging the edges down. And just smoothing those out, because we want a nice, even, smooth blend of this black. We want this to be very organic. Okay? I still got my dark gray on there. So as I darken things, if I see that some part of it looks like it's too light in comparison, I can go to my dark gray and I can grab that and I can tint out that area along the border. And this will be a gentler color than the black ink. And if I drag it up and toward the part I'm turning very black, obviously the dark gray over the black isn't going to do anything. It's not going to turn it any less black. It just has no effect on it. Okay? Plus, the zenithal on these cloaks just really does work great. These Chaos Warrior cloaks are just so easy for this technique to be just fantastically applied. because it has all these wonderful ridges. Like ruffles, they also have ridges. Okay. So you can see now how we're getting towards something that's a pretty black cloak, right? If you ever feel like you over-highlight it, that's why I keep my German gray around. This is my black gray, and this is my sort of... Oops, stay there, Chaos Warrior. This is going to act as my highest highlight that I'll allow on the linen, okay? On linen, something like this German gray is simply as light as you want to go. So if I'm not sure, I can drag some of that out, thin it out, get it down to a nice thin glaze, and I can take it down in the opposite direction over the rest of the cloak to smooth everything out. Okay? And then in reverse, we can go back to the black ink. And again, we can just keep laying some of that black ink up in there. We keep taking it down and down and down. Remember, this is the one with the least variation. So we want it to be nice and dark, something like that, right? Now, you can continue just repeating this back and forth, doing this slight blend, but you're traveling over a very short distance here. So in all honesty, it's not that tough of a blend. You could take your German gray, you could trace it up some if you want, up into the higher points, right? So with our thin to German gray, we could come up into the ridge of these cloaks if we want to keep pulling that ridge out, maybe smooth out some of those edges. Again, that ink's still a little wet, so I can move it around, get a little wet blend action there. It's just that easy. Okay? So, that's it. It's really that simple. When you move it down, that's a black cloak. Because of the zenithal on it, because of that, it still looks like we've got a nice amount of color variation. You can see as I turn it there, once it dries, the sheen will go away, because the nice part about the Vallejo Gaming is it's really matte in how it dries. You can see we've got a nice variation there. Now, if we want to go all the way up, we can come back to this later, and I'll show you a neat trick you can do to create a little life in this cloak. But for now, we're just going to let it dry completely. We'll come back to it. Let's move on to our next fun black technique. For that, we come to the front. And what we're going to talk about now are booties. That's right, we're going to talk about Chaos booties. All right, so Chaos leather boots. Okay, so leather has a higher level of satin sheen, right? And what we want to do is try to capture that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I actually want to knock some of the color out of this. So, because it's just it turned out a little too gray with my zenithal, and that's okay. It was still useful because it creates my areas of highlight. Like, you see how it caught the edge of this ridge? That's what we want. We're using the zenithal to do that. But I'm going to grab some of my dark gray. Again, you could use a Nuln or any other kind of kind of black shade. And I'm going to run it over the whole boot pretty evenly. It's thinned just slightly. And I'm going to purposely let it gather in some of these recesses. Okay? So what I'm doing there is just tinting it back down and letting it set. That's going to take a moment to set. Okay? So we're going to talk about what our color scheme is here. All right. So when you're highlighting leather, there are two sorts of keys you want to think about with that sheen, and they're unusual colors. You wouldn't normally think that they'd be where you'd go. But the colors we're going to go for are this, which is our German camo black brown. Again, I'm sure there's a color equivalent in all paint ranges, but it's a dark black brown. There you go. Find whatever thing is a dark black brown in your color, in your paint line of choice, and you'll be good to go. The other thing we're going to go for is an extremely light what we want is an extremely light gray blue. Okay, so there's lots of different choices here that you could go for. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to go for our glacier blue. Okay, so these are our two colors we're putting onto our palette: our German camo black brown and our glacier blue. Very, very different apart. And the reason we're going to do that, the brown is sort of the earth tone, the warm tone of the reflection. The glacier blue is sort of a cold tone of the reflection. Light has warmth and darkness in it, incandescence or coldness to it. And so whenever we're reflecting light, we want to think about what type of light is reflecting. And leather usually reflects fairly white. It's just how it looks. As it catches the light, because that satin sheen, as it reflects, tends to look that way. You can almost see it the way it looks there, reflecting the light. That's just because of wet paint. You can see how that has like a very bright white sheen to it. Okay, so we're going to get out a little bit more thinner medium out on the palette, and we're going to put a little retardant medium down as well for us to use. We've still got the other colors on our palette. We've still got our black inks out here. Those are going to come in useful. Okay. Is that dry yet? No, still waiting. All right, that's okay. Let's go back to our cloak, and then we'll talk about that. So that's all dry, and you can see how that looks now. And if that's still not black enough for you, remember, you can always come back in with that black ink and just keep, the key is you can just keep working the lower sections down until you get something that's just really, really pitch black in those shadows. Okay? Like I said, at the end of this, we're going to come back in actually just a moment with our color we're about to make, and we're going to hit this, and we're going to make this cape pop a little. Okay. Let's go back to the shoe. It's good enough. It's dry enough for our purposes. All right. So, what we're going to do is we're going to take some of our thinner, some of our retardant medium. We're going to get into that brown over here on our palette fairly heavily, and we're going to pull in just a little bit of white. I'm sorry, of the glacier blue. But we want to be pretty heavily mixed on the black brown. Then I'm going to pull in just a dab of my black ink. I want to create that. I want to knock the vibrance out of that tone. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to trace kind of where the light would catch with this dark color. This isn't going to move the palette much, or move the color much. So I'm going to hit the edge of the boot here. That. I'm going to hit each of these ridges down here. Front of the shoe. Right, the places where you can sort of think of light as having gathered. And you're going to go fairly heavily on this. We're also just going to hit the top of the boot, right? So just along the top. Okay. We'll do one shoe for now. I'll just grab the other one real quick. Doesn't take long. Okay. So, we've got a little bit of that brown applied there, right? And you can see just that slight brightness to it. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to mix this same mix we pulled over here of the brown and blue. We're going to pull it the other direction. We're going to go mostly into the white with it. Okay? Or sorry, I keep saying white. Into the glacier blue with it. I apologize. And again, I think this is Fenrisian gray or something in Citadel. So, if you want to go that direction. So what I end up with here on my palette, let's see if we can get that, is one that's very sort of chocolatey and one that's very milk chocolatey. Oh, that ink runs. That wasn't great. That's okay. All right. So we end up with this sort of gray color, but it's got a little bit more character than gray. A little bit more vibrancy to it. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to trace very lightly, lighter than that, So I'm going to just trace the edges here of this boot. I'm going to try to catch all the places where they'd be light. We want to go very fine touch. Okay? So what we get is something like that. Now, as it stands, that's pretty extreme, right? That's almost an edge highlight. And of course it is, because we've jumped from this one all the way to the other. That's okay. We knew that was going to happen. What we're going to do now is we've got our two colors here right next to each other. We're going to add in some more of our retardant and thinner medium. We're going to just kind of pull them together into something in the middle. And we want it to get way thin down. Okay? Now these are, pretty thick, heavy colors. So we want something real thin. And what we're going to do now with that thinner color is we're just going to kind of go over all those things we just hit. Sort of in the middle of where we put the first one and the last one. Right? And you can see how just a little bit of that color shines through. Right? Now that looks a little brown on camera, but I assure you that's mostly the light of this room, the yellow light of this room playing with it. Like, even to my eye, in reality, it still looks quite black. But if it's not black enough for you, take the black ink. Remember I said we have that on our palette. And now what we're going to do is we're going to create the blackness. So we're going to get some of that ink, thin down, and we're going to recreate our shadows. We're going to drive those shadows all the way down to be black. Again, you could just do this with thin to black paint if you wanted. And then we can just smooth out that edge. You just pull out a little bit of that paint, just wiped off the brush, we just smooth that edge a little. So now what we get is that. We've got the boot way down, we've got the black recarved out, and we've got a nice little highlight. If you want to take it back up a little more, again, you can just keep repeating this process, right? The key to this is you can sort of do this as many times as you want if you want to get these really smooth blends. So I could come back in here and just create little points of light on the very corner of the leather where it might really catch. Just create little sheen points. Right? Something like that. So it looks like those few points where the light has really caught. And you can keep going back and smoothing those down. Now, and that's more or less a good black leather boot, right? You get a little bit of a brown tone in there. If you don't want it to be very brown, use very little. Mix your brown more with black. You can play around with all that stuff. But the key is you want a nice brownish black. How black you want it is for you. And leather tends to have a natural sort of almost organic brown to it. Even black leather has some form of brown in it because it's an organic living creature. It's not this weird night black thing. That's what it was made from originally. And you want your blue, your white, blue, gray, something like that, because that's what you want to create your light. That's going to be your cold light. Okay? It kind of catches the edges there. Now, I mentioned about this cloak. Interesting thing about this cloak is it's got all these little tears and puncture wounds in it, right? Okay. So now let's get back into that paint that we just made. So the lighter color. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and I'm just going to hit a little more of that paint. It's a little too thin. We don't want to be that thin. We want a controlled paint here. There we go. Okay, we're going to take a little of this paint and we're just going to hit the bottom of the ridges of this cloak. Like of these little holes. Light touch. very light touch. Okay, and so what we're doing here is we're creating some little focal points where the light would catch the bottom. Okay, so now what we get is that. If you wanted to, you could even very lightly maybe hit one side of the edges of the bottom of the cloak. Just carry that illusion all the way through. We don't hit every side. We're not lining the whole bottom because we're meaning to catch a directionality here. Okay? So then what we get is something like that. And to me, that's a much more visually interesting cloak. The other part that's good about this is look how much more black that looks with just a tiny bit of the lighter color added. Okay? In the same way that, like, if you've ever tried to take a good picture of your miniature with a camera, you see the light slide up and down real fast when, like, you move your hand in the camera or something, well, as it tries to play with the white balance and the aperture adjusts and it's trying to let the right amount of light in. Your eye is a lot like a camera aperture and will adjust how it views colors based on what it's taking in. Contrast, having a very bright white, or this isn't really white, but having this sort of brown, even this appears very white to your eye in that little bit. It's really not. Like looking at it on the palette, okay? Let's take that away for a second. And let's look at this on the palette. It was that color right there. You see that, like, light? That is not white. If this was on your wall right here, you would not think that was a white color on your wall. But that is the color you're seeing right there. Okay? It looks more white because it's against black, and conversely, it makes the black look darker. Just a little touch like that. Okay. Same thing over here on the boot. By having those just few very high highlights on the edge, it makes the rest look darker. You can see now that everything's dry how that looks. Got a nice leather boot. All right, so linen, leather, armor. All right, let's talk about armor. I'm not going to do all the armor on this guy. That would take forever. What we're going to do is we're going to do basically, I'm going to go sort of into detail on one plate. This is going to be the toughest part of what we do. Because with black metal, you need to really create the reflection, okay? Because if it's truly metal, if it's not just enameled, in which case it would probably look more like leather. If it's enameled, it's going to be satiny and look more like that. If we're really trying to replicate like a blackened armor, like a very dark steel or something. Well, metal is just by its nature, because it's opaque and doesn't let light through, is going to be more reflective. So now we need to really think about our light points, right? And so here, I'm going to say the light's coming down in this direction. And so this part of the armor plate would be the lightest right here, fading up into darkness. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to take a little of our thinned down German gray. We're going to get that on our brush. Not all the way up, about that much. Then we're just going to put the tip of this just a touch into that glacier blue. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to touch that edge, and I'm going to start pushing the brush. Actually, let's do it this direction because it'll be easier. Okay, and I'm just going to start pushing the brush slightly harder as I do it, so the color mixes in there and gives me a nice blend. Okay? So what I get is something like that. Basically a little loaded brush. Now, the trick with this is, anytime you're doing this kind of enameled type of armor, it's never a quick process. Because you can see in that one, I didn't get it to go completely evenly. We've still got a little bit of a light source there. So I can take a little of my darker ink, can glaze that back in that, and so on and so forth. There's a couple different ways you could attack this. So we could do that loaded brush a couple times, smooth it all down with the glaze, and then do it again. If you're not comfortable with that, let's talk about the simplest, quickest way we could do it. Okay. The simplest, quickest way we could do it is we can take some of our German gray, we can get it out here on our palette, and we can do a mixture into our glacier blue. And on our palette, we run just a line from pure to dark. Okay, so I've got a nice little spread there. And then what I'm going to do, this is a little more time consuming. If you can nail the loaded brush a couple times, you can really get there with just a glaze or two afterward. But it's a trickier technique. As I'm going to start on the lightest color. I'm going to go into my retardant medium, just a little. I'm going to lay that on the edge here where I want the light. And I'm going to go down a step into my darker color. I'm going to hit the edge of that. Just kind of blend that in. I'm going to go down another step. Again, I'm just pulling into the darker colors. I'm going to blend in that edge. Okay? I'm going to go down another step, all the way into the German gray, refreshing my retardant medium because I'm getting running low on it and I want to keep everything nice and wet. I'm going to blend that in. Right? And just real quick, just like that, because of that retardant medium, I've got a nice, even blend. Well, pretty much so. If you zoomed way in there, you'd see a little bit of line still. But for some quick action, it's really not bad. The final thing we're going to do to take that up is we're going to get some of that thinned glacier blue, and we're going to use the old favorite trick of GW itself, and that is we're going to go ahead and just do a very, very light edge highlight. Light touch. Okay? And that then sort of completes our illusion of the black armor. You can see how dark it is in the shadow there, coming out to the light. And all that is, so I'll show you my palette again. Okay? So you can see this spread here of colors, just going from the blue down to the black. And I just kept dragging with the retardant medium to make sure that I just kept it wet and just blended it out, just that fast, right? Let's do it again. We'll do it on, let's see, what should we do it on? I'm trying to find another spot that's big enough to show. Let's do it here, on his knee pad here. We'll blend that out. Here, the light point would be right here, on the top of the knee, and blend out like that. So we'll just do this circular knee pad, okay? All right, so we go into our retardant medium, grab a little bit of our lightest color. And we're going to push that there. And we're going to go darker. And we're going to blend that down on both sides here. And we're going to go one step darker. We're going to grab that and smooth out that edge. And we're going to go all the way, we're going to refresh our retardant medium, go all the way into our German gray. We're going to smooth that edge. Right? And just like that, we got a nice even blend on the knee. Now we want to complete the illusion. So we're going to take our glacier blue, again with a very fine tip, just a lightest touch. And we're going to just go ahead, we're going to run like a little thin line right down like that. Now we want to smooth that a little, so we're going to just retouch it while it's still wet. We're going to just push it out. Just like that. Now we got a nice reinforced highlight there. Okay? You can just repeat that on every little plate of the armor. Again, doing like an interesting black metal armor takes longer. You got to kind of work plate by plate. Because the quick way to do it, quick, i.e. the way to quickly do each plate, is exactly like I said. You get that out on your palette, you go through 4 or 5 steps, and if you really want to smooth it out at the end, you can just black glaze the whole thing, very thin black glaze, with everything except your highest highlight. You just do it again. As with everything, you just repeat these steps many times. Okay? So, again, black linen, mostly black, very little highlight, rely on a few interesting points of contrast. If you don't have like rips and tears in the cloak, You could also just add like dirt or something at the bottom of the cloak in a light brown. Putting on a light brown adds color, adds interest, will make the black seem blacker because the light brown of dirt getting up there would keep it live. Boots, again, we want a little bit of earthy brown in there and a black brown to find the amount of mix that you like, to give that more natural organic feeling to the leather, and then that bright white to get the edges. Metal needs to be reflective, so you're creating where light falls. You're doing it from a chain from a blue-white out to the black, and you're just mixing it slowly. Okay? All right, I promised you one more, so here we go. Final one. We're going to talk about doing black metal. Okay, so for that, I'm going to get the darkest metal I've got, which is the Vallejo acrylic metal color gunmetal gray. Now, as I've said on many previous videos, if you don't own paints in the Vallejo metal color series, if you're still using any other metal paint in the world, you're doing it wrong. I don't normally say that, as you hear me say, I don't care what paint you use half the time, or most of the time, 90% of the time. I just tell you use whatever paint you like, and I try to give equivalencies. This is simply the best metallic paint out there. A new one just came on the market. I ordered it from the UK just to test it to make sure I can still say that with authority. But I will say, of the more than a dozen other metal paints I've used from 6 or 7 different brands, none have ever worked as well as this paint. This is beyond any other metal. Let's see if I can prove that to you. Here's this axe. It's just basically black because I didn't even bother really zenithal it much. I'm going to touch that gunmetal. And look at how smooth. Like butter this paint's on. Just like butter. Instant coverage, never an issue, but at the same time, it's a very wet paint, and what that means is that it stays wet just long enough for you to blend it, which is going to come in handy in just a moment. Because the normal problem with metallic paints is that you can't really blend them, and so the lines on them look really, really harsh. But not this stuff. Okay. So now we've got a very dark steel. All right, like you can barely tell that's metallic unless I hold it against the light. But we're going to go darker. We're going to go darker. We're going to go back to our old friend, the black ink. And what we're going to do is we want to create our highlights here, okay? And so we're going to work up toward the corner here of the axe, not leaving this part out, this ridge line. I'm working up toward pulling the ink up toward the very top corner of this, and then I'm going to pull the ink down here on the axe, on this ridge line. We're going to use this non-metallic metal technique because ultimately what you want is you want to create these points of contrast where the light is playing differently because of the angles. Okay? We'll do the same thing in the back here where we can. We'll drop a little up top, up to there. We'll do the same thing on this side. We're going to do this fairly quick. I would be much more careful about this if I was going, you know, all out or something. Okay? All right, so now you should be able to see that contrast. It's very slight, but it's there. Okay. See that? Yeah, you can see that. Okay. All right, so now we're going to let that black ink dry a little, but I'm not going to stop what I'm doing because I'm going to go to a different direction. So now I'm going to grab sort of a mid-tone, which is actually just dark aluminum, my favorite little mid-tone metal in this range. I've still got that gunmetal gray handy. Okay. I'm going to grab my dark aluminum, which is actually quite bright, or it'll seem ridiculously bright against this super dark metal. It's not actually that bright. And what I'm going to do is just very lightly pull it up on there, and then I'm going to pull it down toward here. Okay? Now, that's really going to stand out strong. And remember I said this stays wet and it can blend. We're going to, with the paint still on the end of our brush, we're going to grab our mid-tone color We're just going to smooth out that edge. And because that stays wet, it just blends so easy. Like butter. If you want to go all the way back into your black ink, you can do that. And just pull that right up. Just kill out all those lines. You get that nice, smooth, even blend. The key when you're doing very dark metal is you need to have a few points, but they need to be small, of extreme contrast. So here I'm going to use the bottom of the axe and the very top of the axe, right, to just create that little bit of like true metal sort of sheen. Everything else is going to be very muted. We're going to use that purposely because we want it to appear very dark in everywhere except this bottom point. Okay. Now what I'm going to do, we're going to take it all the way. In the same way we used the very bright white, or that white blue, sorry, to make the dark seem darker on the back of the cloak, we're going to grab a little silver, which is about the brightest color in this range outside of chrome, which is the only one of this range I don't recommend. The only color I don't like. And you can see, by the way, if you look on the palette, you can really see the color difference. This is the steel, or the gunmetal, sorry. That's the dark aluminum. That's the dark aluminum. That's the silver. It's significantly different. There you go. Okay. All right. We're going to grab a little of that silver. Just a little. This stuff is powerful. And what I'm going to do is, at the very top here, and on the edge, I'm just going to lay a little dot in on the very edge. On the back edge here, I'm going to just light touch edge highlight and lay a tiny little bit down at the bottom of the ridge. What that'll do is create that super bright point of contrast. Okay? Now, if you really wanted to go all the way with this, your next steps would be you could do some more careful edge highlighting with probably a bit of your mid-tone. I could grab a little of the gunmetal, mix it up with a little of the dark aluminum. Right? So we've got something controlled. And here at my darkest points, I could just lightly edge highlight to peel out these edges where the light would catch. Again, we'd want to be fairly careful with this because we don't want to... The key with this edge highlighting, as always, is you never want your brush to go sideways. See how the brush bends when it hits my thumb? It should be no bend at all. If it bends, you've hit it too hard. Bob Ross used to say 2 hairs and some air. Same deal. That's how you edge highlight. 2 hairs and some air. Okay? Again, that contrast will then make that all stand out. As usual, you can then play around with that. You can darken up that metal with more black ink or whatever you want to do. If you want to get your darks nice and dark, and keep working it down. Right? Kind of smooth out the edge of that ink. There we go. So that's how we do our very dark metal. All right? So that's pretty much everything I can think of to talk about with painting black. Linen, leather, armor plates, steel. There you go. That's painting black. All right, and there's our Chaos Knight. Not ready to go, obviously, but he's well on his way. Axes. There you go. So hopefully it's very late and I recorded a lot of these. Hopefully this helps a lot. I certainly appreciate you watching. As always, if you've got any questions or you want to see other hobby cheating specific techniques, leave it down in the comments below. Give the video a like if you like it. Subscribe if you want to see more hobby cheating in the future. And as always, we'll see you next time.